He called her simple while pouring vintage wine for his boss. He laughed when she fumbled with the silverware, apologizing to his guests for his wife's lack of breeding. Richard Sterling truly believed he was the prize in their marriage. He thought Isabella was just a nobody, a quiet girl from the countryside he had rescued from obscurity. He loved the way she made him feel powerful. But Richard made a fatal miscalculation. He didn't know that the woman quietly enduring his insults wasn't a nobody. She was the estranged heiress to the Kensington dynasty, a family so powerful they didn't just buy companies. They bought countries. And tonight, just as Richard is about to humiliate her one last time, a fleet of black Rolls-Royces is turning onto their street. The king is coming for his daughter, and Richard Sterling is about to learn that some silences are not weakness. They are a warning. The aroma of rosemary roasted lamb filled the modern minimalist kitchen of the house in the suburbs of Connecticut. It was a nice house, a status symbol. Not a mansion, but the kind of four-bedroom colonial that screamed upper-middle management on the rise. Isabella Sterling wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. She had been cooking since 6 in the morning. Every vegetable was julienned to perfection. The silver was polished until it mirrored her exhausted expression. She checked the vintage of the wine, a 2015 Chateau Margaux that Richard had insisted on. It cost more than her first car, but Richard said it was necessary. "Isabella!" The voice came from the living room, sharp and impatient. Richard walked in, adjusting his silk tie in the reflection of the microwave. He was a handsome man objectively. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of jawline that suited a boardroom. But his eyes were always scanning, always calculating the worth of everything around him, including his wife. "Is the sauce reduced? Mr. Halloway is very particular about consistency," Richard said, not looking at her but rather at the shine on his Italian leather shoes. "It's perfect, Richard. Just like you asked," Isabella said softly, turning down the heat. "I used the recipe from that chef in Paris you like." Richard scoffed, a short, dismissive sound. "Let's hope you didn't botch it. You know you have a tendency to over-season. Just try to fade into the background tonight." "All right, Halloway is considering me for the senior partner position. This dinner is the final test. I need everything to look sophisticated." He walked over to her, reaching out as if to touch her cheek, but instead he picked a stray lint off her shoulder. "And change that dress," he added, his voice dropping to a patronizing whisper. "It looks domestic. Wear the black one I bought you. The one that makes you look like you actually belong in this tax bracket." Isabella felt the familiar sting in her chest, a cold weight she had carried for 3 years. When they had met, Richard had been charming, ambitious, and seemingly kind. But as his career at Sterling and Vance Global skyrocketed, his respect for her had plummeted. To him, she was the girl from nowhere. She had told him she was an orphan raised by a strict grandmother in rural England, cut off from any family money. It was a half-truth, a necessary lie to escape a life she hadn't wanted. "I'll change," Isabella said, her voice steady. "But Richard, please, don't make jokes about my education tonight. Not in front of them." Richard laughed, checking his Rolex Submariner. "Oh, Bella, don't be so sensitive. I'm just managing expectations. If they know you're simple, they won't judge you when you can't keep up with the conversation about the market or politics. I'm doing you a favor." The doorbell rang. It was a sharp, demanding sound. Richard's face transformed instantly. The sneer vanished, replaced by a winning, eager smile. He pointed a finger at her. "Wine. Now. And don't spill it." As he rushed to the door, Isabella looked down at her trembling hands. She took a deep breath, centering herself. She remembered the lessons her grandmother, the Duchess Beatrice Kensington, had drilled into her since birth. A queen does not scream, Isabella. A queen endures until she strikes. She untied her apron. It was going to be a long night. The dining room was dimly lit, illuminated by the expensive crystal chandelier Richard had gone into debt to purchase. Seated around the mahogany table were the people Richard desperately wanted to impress. There was Arthur Halloway, the CEO of the firm, a man with cold gray eyes who looked at people as if they were assets on a spreadsheet. Next to him was his wife, Evelyn, a woman dripping in diamonds who had already critiqued Isabella's curtains twice. Then there was Brad and Jessica, Richard's rival colleague and his social climbing wife. "So, Richard," Arthur Halloway said, swirling the Chateau Margaux in his glass. "This quarter's numbers were impressive. You've got a killer instinct. We need that in the London office." Richard beamed, leaning forward. "Thank you, Arthur. I believe in total dedication. If you want success, you have to cut the dead weight and focus on quality, in business and in life." Isabella entered the room carrying the heavy platter of roast lamb. The smell was divine, rich with garlic and rosemary. She moved with a natural grace, a silent elegance that went unnoticed by the table, except perhaps by Arthur Halloway, who watched her with a curious frown. "Here we are," Isabella said softly, placing the platter down. "Finally." Richard sighed, rolling his eyes theatrically for his guests. "I thought you'd gotten lost in the pantry, Bella. Though to be fair, the map to the kitchen is the only one she can read." Brad and Jessica chuckled. Evelyn Halloway offered a pitying smile. "Now, Richard," Evelyn said, her voice dripping with faux sweetness, "don't be mean. The lamb looks delicious. Did you make this yourself, dear? Or did you have it catered?" "I made it," Isabella said, taking her seat at the far end of the table. "Bella is quite the homemaker," Richard said, pouring more wine for Arthur. "It's really her ceiling, you know. I try to talk to her about the Nikkei index or the geopolitical shifts in the Baltic, and her eyes just glaze over, like a deer in headlights." "Richard," Isabella warned, her voice low. "Oh, come on, honey." Richard grinned, fueled by the wine in the audience. "Tell them about the time you thought the Dow Jones was a neighbor down the street." The table erupted in laughter. It was a lie. Richard had invented that story a month ago at a cocktail party, and it had gotten a laugh, so now it was part of his repertoire. Isabella gripped her napkin under the table. Her knuckles were white. "I never said that, Richard." "She's modest." Richard winked at Arthur. "But honestly, it's refreshing. I spend all day dealing with intellectuals and sharks. It's nice to come home to someone uncomplicated. Simple pleasures, right?" "There is a dignity in simplicity," Arthur Halloway said slowly, his eyes fixed on Isabella. "Though I must say this sauce is a beurre rouge with a hint of truffle oil, isn't it?" Isabella looked up surprised. "Yes. I used a reduction of shallots and port, finishing it with white truffle." "Sophisticated for a simple girl," Arthur noted. Richard quickly interjected, sensing he was losing control of the narrative. "She watches a lot of cooking shows. Monkey see, monkey do. Anyway, Arthur, about the expansion into the European market." As Richard launched into his rehearsed pitch, Jessica leaned over to Isabella, lowering her voice. "It's so sweet that he takes care of you. I mean, without him, where would you be? Probably waiting tables in some diner, right?" Isabella looked at Jessica. In her mind, she saw the great hall of Kensington Manor, where she had learned to debate philosophy with prime ministers and play chess with grandmasters. She saw the stables where she rode thoroughbreds worth more than this entire subdivision. "I imagine I would survive," Isabella said coolly. "Survive." Richard overheard the word and laughed again. "Bella, you can't even handle a credit card bill without panicking. Let's be real. I'm the anchor here." The dinner progressed, and with every course Richard's confidence swelled and his cruelty sharpened. He felt the promotion was in the bag. He felt invincible. To him, putting Isabella down was a way of elevating himself, showing that he was the alpha, the provider, the benevolent king tolerating a lesser subject. By the time dessert was served, a delicate crème brûlée, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Even the guests were starting to shift uncomfortably. Richard's insults had moved from playful to straight malice. "You know," Richard said, leaning back and unbuttoning his suit jacket, "we were thinking of vacationing in Italy this summer. but I'm worried Bella here will get lost in the airport. Maybe we should just stick to a road trip, something manageable for her." "I speak Italian, Richard," Isabella said. She hadn't meant to say it. It just slipped out. The room went silent. Richard stared at her, blinking. Then he burst out laughing, a loud barking sound that grated on the ears. "You speak Italian, Bella. Ordering a pizza doesn't count. Ciao, Bella doesn't mean you're fluent." "I am fluent," she said, her voice gaining a hard edge. "Ho imparato quando ero bambina. La lingua è la chiave della cultura." "I learned when I was a child. Language is the key to culture." Richard's face turned red. He felt undermined. He slammed his wine glass down, splashing red liquid onto the pristine white tablecloth. "Stop it," he snapped. "Stop trying to sound smart. You memorized a phrase from a book. It's pathetic. You're embarrassing yourself. You're embarrassing me." He turned to his guest, spreading his hands. "I apologize. She gets these delusions of grandeur sometimes. It's the insecurity. She knows she married up and she tries too hard to compensate." "Married up?" Isabella stood up slowly. The chair scraped against the floor, a harsh sound that cut through the room. "Sit down, Isabella," Richard hissed. "I have cooked for you." Isabella said, her voice trembling, not with fear but with a rage she had suppressed for 3 years. "I have cleaned your home. I have supported your career. I have listened to your rehearsals for these meetings until 200 a.m., and you sit there and tell these strangers that I am nothing." "You are nothing without me," Richard shouted, losing his composure. The veneer of the sophisticated executive cracked. "Look at you, you have no family, you have no money, you have no name. You are Isabella Sterling because I gave you that name. Before me you were a ghost." "I," Isabella said, her eyes flashing with a cold, terrifying fire, "was never a ghost. I was in hiding. And you, Richard, you have just made a mistake you cannot afford." "Oh, sit down and shut up." Richard waved a hand dismissively. "Go to the kitchen and make coffee. Let the adults talk." Isabella didn't move toward the kitchen. She looked at the grandfather clock in the corner. It was 8:00 p.m. exactly. "I think," Isabella said calmly, "that coffee will not be necessary." "Why?" Richard sneered. "Did you forget to buy beans?" "No," she replied, looking toward the front window where headlights were sweeping across the darkened lawn. "Because my ride is here." "Ride? You don't have a car. You don't have friends." Richard laughed, turning to Arthur. "She's hysterical. I'm so sorry." But Arthur Halloway wasn't looking at Richard. He was looking out the window, his face pale. "Richard," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "look outside." Richard turned. The street, usually quiet and empty, was filled with light. Not just one car. A convoy. 3 massive black SUVs with tinted windows were blocking the driveway. Behind them sat a sleek vintage Rolls-Royce Phantom 6, the kind of car reserved for royalty and heads of state. The flags on the hood fluttered in the night wind. Men in dark suits with earpieces were exiting the SUVs with military precision, flanking the walkway to the front door. They moved with the terrifying efficiency of private security for the ultra-elite. "What is this?" Richard stammered, standing up. "Who are these people? Is this a raid, Arthur? Are we being audited?" "That's not the FBI," Arthur whispered, recognizing the crest on the flag of the Rolls-Royce. It was a golden lion holding a rose. That's the Kensington crest." Richard looked at Isabella. She hadn't moved. She stood at the head of the table, her posture shifting. The slumped shoulders of the housewife were gone. Her chin was raised, her back straight as a steel rod. "You said I had no name, Richard," she said softly. The front door didn't ring this time. It didn't need to. The heavy oak door was pushed open by a large man in a suit who stepped aside. Into the hallway walked a young man in a bespoke Savile Row suit, looking like a younger, sharper version of Isabella. Behind him walked an older woman with silver hair leaning on a cane topped with a diamond the size of a walnut. She wore a coat that cost more than Richard's entire house. The young man looked around the room, his lip curling in disgust at the decor. His eyes landed on Isabella. "It took us 3 years to find you, Bella," the man said, his British accent clipped and posh. "Mother is furious, but Grandiose—" He gestured to the old woman. "Grandiose just wants to know why you're living in this shoebox." Richard was frozen. He looked from the strangers to his wife. "Bella," Richard squeaked, "who are these people?" Isabella looked at her husband, her eyes devoid of the warmth he had taken for granted. "Richard," she said, "allow me to introduce my brother Alexander Kensington, Duke of Worcester, and my grandmother, the Dowager Duchess Beatrice Kensington. And you," the old woman spoke, her voice like cracking ice, staring directly at Richard, "must be the little man who thinks it is amusing to insult my granddaughter." The silence in the dining room was heavy, suffocating. It was the kind of silence that usually precedes a natural disaster. Richard blinked, his mind struggling to process the visual information in front of him. His brain was short-circuiting. The Duchess Beatrice Kensington. The Kensingtons owned half of London's real estate. They were old money, the kind of money that didn't shout, but whispered and made governments tremble. "This is a joke!" Richard stammered, his laugh sounding frantic and high-pitched. "Bella, did you hire actors? Is this some sort of revenge for the Italian comment? Because it's not funny. It's expensive and it's not funny." Alexander, the Duke of Worcester, stepped fully into the room. He was taller than Richard, leaner, but he moved with the predatory grace of a panther. He didn't look at Richard. He looked at the half-eaten roast lamb on the table. "Is this what you feed her?" Alexander asked, picking up a fork and inspecting the meat with disdain. "We have hounds at the estate that eat better cuts." "Now see here." Richard puffed up his chest, trying to reclaim his territory. "This is my house. You can't just barge in here." "Your house?" The Duchess. Beatrice interrupted, tapping her cane on the floor. The sound cracked like a whip. "This mortgage is held by Sentinel Trust, is it not?" Richard faltered. "Yes, but—" "Sentinel Trust is a subsidiary of Kensington Holdings," Beatrice said, her eyes bored into him. "Technically, Mr. Sterling, you are living in my guest house, and you are behind on your payments." The blood drained from Richard's face. Arthur Holloway, the CEO, who had been terrified moments ago, suddenly stood up. He looked at the Duchess and bowed, actually bowed. "Your Grace," Arthur said, his voice trembling. "I had no idea. If I had known Mrs. Sterling was of your blood, I would have never—" "You would have never what, Mr. Holloway?" Isabella spoke up. She walked around the table, moving toward her grandmother. Her posture had completely changed. The submissive slouch was gone, replaced by a regal, terrifying calm. "You would have never laughed when my husband called me stupid. You would have never mocked my cooking. Or does your respect only exist when you know someone has a checkbook larger than yours?" Arthur turned red, stammering. "Mrs. Sterling, Isabella, it was just banter. Office humor." "It was cruelty," Isabella said simply. She reached out and took her grandmother's hand. "Hello, Grandiose. You look well." "And you look tired, child," Beatrice said, her icy demeanor softening only for a fraction of a second as she looked at her granddaughter. Then the ice returned as she looked back at Richard. "We have come to collect you. The experiment is over." Richard felt the room spinning. He looked at Isabella, his Bella, the woman he scolded for buying the wrong brand of detergent. "Bella, tell them to leave," Richard pleaded, switching tactics to manipulation. "Honey, look, I'm sorry about the dinner. I was stressed. I didn't mean it. We can talk about this. Just send them away and we'll go to bed. I'll make it up to you." Alexander laughed. It was a dark, dry sound. "Make it up to her. You think you can apologize for 3 years of psychological erosion with a bouquet of flowers and a night of mediocre affection? You don't know anything about our marriage." Richard shouted, his fists clenching. "She loves me. She chose me. She left your world to be with me. She left our world to find someone who would love her for herself, not her title. Alexander countered, stepping into Richard's personal space. She wanted to see if a man could love Isabella the person, not Isabella the heiress. She found you. And you failed the test, Richard. You didn't love the person. You loved having a punching bag to make yourself feel big. Richard looked at Isabella, desperation in his eyes. Bella, that's not true. Tell them. Isabella looked at her husband. For the first time in 3 years, she looked at him and saw him clearly. He wasn't a powerful executive. He was a small, insecure boy in a suit, terrified of being ordinary. They are right, Richard, she said softly. I waited. Every day I waited for you to be kind. I waited for you to ask me about my day instead of telling me what I did wrong. I waited for you to look at me with love, not criticism. But tonight, when you laughed at me in front of strangers, I realized something. What? Richard whispered. That I am not the one who is lucky to be here, Isabella said. You were the lucky one. And you just ran out of luck. Enough of this soap opera, the Duchess stated firmly. Alexander, get her bags. We are leaving, now. Wait! Richard lunged forward to grab Isabella's arm. You can't just walk out. You're my wife. Before his fingers could graze her sleeve, 2 of the security guards moved with blurring speed. One blocked Richard's path while the other twisted his arm behind his back, pinning him against the wall. Hey, let go of me! This is assault! Richard screamed, kicking out. Let him go, Isabella commanded. The guards hesitated, looking to the Duchess. Isabella raised her voice, a tone of absolute authority. I said let him go. The guards released him. Richard stumbled forward, rubbing his shoulder, his face twisted in a mix of fear and fury. You're going to regret this, Richard spat. You walk out that door and you get nothing. No alimony, no support. I'll make sure you starve. The room went deadly silent. Even the Duchess looked shocked by the sheer stupidity of the threat. Then Arthur Halloway made a choking sound. Richard, shut up. For God's sake, shut up. Why? Richard snapped at his boss. I'm the victim here. She's abandoning me. Arthur looked at the Duchess, sweat pouring down his face. Your Grace, please understand, Richard's views do not reflect the values of Sterling and Vance Global. Is that so? The Duchess walked over to the table and picked up the bottle of Chateau Margaux. She examined the label. Mr. Halloway, do you know who sits on the board of the conglomerate that just acquired Sterling and Vance last week? Arthur's eyes went wide. The acquisition. It was an anonymous holding company. Blue Lion Capital. The Blue Lion, Beatrice said calmly, is the Kensington family seal. Richard froze. He looked from the Duchess to Arthur. We bought your company on Tuesday, Beatrice continued, looking bored. We were doing due diligence on the assets, and it seems we have found a redundant asset that needs to be liquidated. She looked at Richard. Richard Sterling. Beatrice announced, her voice ringing like a gavel in a courtroom. As the majority shareholder of your parent company, I am terminating your employment, effective immediately, for cause. For cause, Richard shrieked. What cause? Gross incompetence. Beatrice smiled thinly. And creating a hostile work environment. I don't like how you treat your peers, and I certainly don't like how you treat your wife. And since your wife is technically a shareholder, you have insulted ownership. You can't do that, Richard yelled, turning to Arthur. Arthur, tell her I'm the best earner you have. Arthur couldn't even look Richard in the eye. Richard, pack your desk. I can't protect you from this. You just insulted the owner. Richard collapsed into a chair. The promotion, the senior partner position, the bonus. It was all gone in seconds. And regarding the house, Alexander added, checking his phone, I just spoke to the bank. Since you are now unemployed, you are a high-risk borrower. Sentinel Trust is calling in the loan. You have 30 days to vacate the premises before foreclosure proceedings begin. Richard stared at the floor. His entire life, his career, his home, his status had been dismantled in under 10 minutes. Why? Richard whispered, tears of rage and self-pity welling in his eyes. Why didn't you tell me, Bella? If I had known who you were. If you had known, Isabella said, standing over him. "You would have pretended to be a good man, and I would have never known the truth about your heart." The silence that followed the Duchess's pronouncement was not merely the absence of noise, it was a physical weight. It pressed down on the dining room, suffocating the air out of the space. The crystal chandelier, which Richard had always claimed was the centerpiece of his success, now seemed to cast a harsh, interrogating light on the ruin of his life. Richard sat slumped in his chair, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. The firing, the foreclosure, the public humiliation. It was too much to process. His brain was frantically trying to find a loophole, a joke, a just kidding, that would reset the world to 5 minutes ago. "I believe," Alexander said, checking his vintage Patek Philippe watch, "that we have wasted enough time in this establishment. Isabella." Isabella looked at her brother, then at her grandmother. For the first time in 3 years, her shoulders didn't feel heavy. The constant low-level hum of anxiety, the fear of burning the roast, of saying the wrong word, of embarrassing Richard, had vanished. In its place was a cold, clear resolve. "I need to pack," Isabella said quietly. "I'll send the staff," Beatrice offered, gesturing to the security team. "We can have this place cleared out in an hour." "No," Isabella shook her head. "I need to do it. There isn't much I want to take." She turned and walked out of the dining room. Alexander followed her, his footsteps heavy on the hardwood stairs. The master bedroom was exactly as Richard liked it, beige, minimalist, and devoid of personality. He called it sleek. Isabella had always found it sterile. She walked to the closet, a space dominated by Richard's suits. Her clothes were pushed to a small section on the far left. She ran her hand over the dresses Richard had insisted she wear. The black cocktail dress that was too tight. The stiff blazers that made her look, in his words, less like a farm girl. "Burn them," Alexander said from the doorway, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed. "All of them. They look cheap. They smell like desperation." Isabella allowed herself a small, sad smile. "He picked them out. He said I didn't have the taste to dress myself." "He wouldn't know taste if it bit him," Alexander scoffed. "Do you remember the gown you wore to the Royal Ascot the year you turned 18, the one grandiose commissioned from Versace?" "I remember," Isabella whispered. She reached to the back of the closet behind the rows of approved beige and gray. She pulled out a small battered cardboard box. Inside wasn't clothing. It was a photo frame face down. She turned it over. It was a picture of her parents laughing on a sailboat in the Mediterranean years before the accident that had taken them. Beside it was a hand-knitted scarf, imperfect and slightly raveled, the first thing she had ever made with her own hands, long before she knew she was an heiress. "Is that it?" Alexander asked gently. 3 years of marriage, Bella. Is that all you have to show for it?" Isabella looked around the room. She looked at the jewelry box on the dresser. It was filled with apology gifts. The diamond earrings Richard bought her after he forgot her birthday. The tennis bracelet he gave her after he was caught texting his secretary. They glittered under the lights, promising value. "Leave the jewelry," Isabella said, her voice hardening. "It belongs to Mrs. Sterling, and she doesn't exist anymore." She placed the photo and the scarf into her tote bag. She walked into the bathroom and grabbed her toothbrush and a bottle of face cream. That was it. "I'm ready," she said. They walked back downstairs. The scene in the dining room had not changed, except the tension had curdled into pure fear. The guests, Brad, Jessica, Evelyn, and Arthur, had not moved. They looked like statues in a museum of discomfort. They were terrified to leave and terrified to stay. They knew that witnessing Richard's destruction was dangerous. They didn't want to be caught in the blast radius. As Isabella reached the bottom of the stairs, Jessica, Richard's social climbing friend, suddenly stood up. Her face was a mask of frantic, desperate friendliness. "Isabella?" Jessica chirped, her voice cracking slightly. She took a step forward, ignoring the glare of the security guard. "Oh my God, I am so shocked. I had no idea about your family. You know, I was just saying to Brad last week that you had such a regal bearing. Didn't I, Brad?" Brad nodded vigorously, looking like a bobblehead doll. Absolutely. Always said it. Class act, Isabella. Total class act. Jessica tried to reach out and touch Isabella's arm. We simply must do lunch. There's this new French bistro downtown, very exclusive. I'd love to hear all about your family. We girls have to stick together, right? Isabella stopped. She looked at Jessica's hand hovering near her sleeve, then looked up at Jessica's eyes. Stick together, Isabella repeated, her tone mild but dangerous. Jessica, 20 minutes ago you asked me if I would be waiting tables at a diner without Richard. You laughed when he said I couldn't read a map. Jessica paled, her hand dropping. Oh, Bella, that was just... You know how Richard gets. We were just playing along to keep the peace. You know I adore you. No, Isabella said, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. You don't adore me. You adore status, and you enjoyed watching me be humiliated because it made you feel superior. Do not contact me. Do not speak to me. If I see you on the street, you will look the other way. Jessica shrank back, her mouth trembling. She collapsed back into her chair, effectively silenced. Isabella turned her attention to the head of the table. Richard was finally stirring. The shock was wearing off, replaced by the ugly realization of his new reality. He saw Isabella wearing her trench coat, holding a single bag. The finality of the image triggered a panic response. He scrambled out of his chair, knocking it over. No, wait, Bella, stop! Richard lunged toward her. 2 security guards stepped in instantly, forming a human wall. Richard bounced off the chest of the larger man, stumbling back. Don't you touch her, Alexander warned, his voice low and menacing. You've lost that privilege. She's my wife, Richard screamed, his face blotchy and red. You can't just kidnap her. Bella, listen to me. I'm sorry, okay? I'm sorry about the job. I'm sorry about the dinner. I'm sorry about everything. I was stressed. The market has been volatile. The pressure from Arthur was too much. I took it out on you, and that was wrong. He fell to his knees, grasping at the air toward her. It was a pathetic display. The arrogant executive reduced to a begging child. Please, baby, Richard sobbed. Don't leave me like this. You heard them. They fired me. They're taking the house. I have nothing. If you leave now, I'm dead. You're the only good thing I have. I love you. Isabella looked down at him. She didn't feel the urge to cry. She didn't feel the urge to comfort him. She felt light. She realized that the man groveling on the floor wasn't a partner. He was a parasite who had attached himself to her kindness and drained it until she was nearly empty. She stepped past the security guard, stopping just out of his reach. You don't love me, Richard, she said softly. You love having someone to blame. You love having a mirror that makes you look big because it makes me look small. You never wanted a wife. You wanted an audience. That's not true. Richard wept. I made you who you are. Isabella reached into her pocket. She pulled out the wedding band. It was a modest ring, one he had bought at a discount pawn shop, claiming it was vintage. She had worn it proudly, thinking it symbolized a fresh start away from her family's overwhelming legacy. Now she saw it for what it was, a cheap band of metal that had chained her to a man who despised her. She placed the ring on the dining table right next to the stain of the Chateau Margaux he had spilled. You didn't make me, Richard, she said. You almost broke me. There is a difference. She turned to leave, but stopped. A thought occurred to her, a final loose thread that needed to be cut. She remembered the insults about the dinner, the way he had mocked her sauce, the way he had claimed she was lucky to get the recipe right. She turned back to him one last time. And Richard? She asked. He looked up, hope flickering in his wet eyes. Yes, Bella. That sauce. She gestured to the cold remnants of the lamb dinner on the table. The beurre rouge with white truffle oil. You told your guests I found the recipe from a famous chef in Paris. Richard wiped his nose, confused. What? Who cares about the sauce, Bella, please? I didn't find the recipe. Isabella interrupted, her voice gaining a steely resonance that filled the room. I wrote it. The restaurant in Paris you're referring to is L'Étoile d'Or. Arthur Halloway gasped. L'Étoile d'Or. That's a 3-Michelin star establishment. It's legendary. Isabella locked eyes with Richard. I bought L'Étoile d'Or 5 years ago. I designed the menu. I trained the head chef. When you told me I was lucky to get the consistency right, you were critiquing the woman who owns the very establishment you dream of dining at. Richard stared at her, his jaw slack. The magnitude of his ignorance was crushing him. He had spent 3 years calling a Michelin star owner incompetent in the kitchen. You, Richard whispered. You own. I own a lot of things, Richard, she said, buttoning her coat. But I no longer own your problems. She turned to the Duchess. I'm ready to go home, grandmother. About time, Beatrice said, banging her cane once for emphasis. Alexander helped Mr. Halloway find the door on his way out. I believe he has a resume to update. The security team formed a phalanx around Isabella. They moved as a single unit, sweeping her out of the dining room through the hallway where she had spent hours scrubbing floors and toward the heavy oak front door. Richard scrambled to his feet, running to the window. Isabella! He screamed, his voice cracking. Isabella, come back! You can't do this to me! He watched through the glass as the chauffeurs opened the door of the Rolls-Royce Phantom. He watched his wife, the woman he had belittled, the woman he had tried to erase, step into the vehicle with the grace of a queen ascending her throne. Alexander stopped before getting into the car. He looked back at the house, at Richard's desperate face pressed against the window pane. He didn't wave. He simply adjusted his cufflinks, got in and closed the door. The convoy of black SUVs and the Rolls-Royce roared to life. Their headlights cut through the darkness of the suburban street, blinding in their intensity. Richard watched them pull away, red taillights fading into the distance. He turned back to the room. The guests were hurriedly gathering their coats, desperate to escape the stench of failure that now permeated the house. Arthur Halloway wouldn't look at him. Jessica was practically running to the door. Richard Sterling stood alone in the center of his status symbol home, surrounded by half-eaten food and the echoes of a woman who was worth more than he could have ever imagined. The silence of the house wasn't peaceful anymore. It was a tomb, and he had dug it himself, one insult at a time. The winter wind in London had a way of cutting through the cheapest fabrics, finding the skin and settling there like a permanent bruise. Richard Sterling pulled the collar of his polyester coat tighter around his neck as he stepped off the night bus. It had been 14 months since the black SUVs had idled in his driveway in Connecticut. 14 months since the door of his own home had slammed shut, locking him out of the life he had thought he was entitled to. The descent had not been a slide. It had been a cliff drop. Richard walked quickly, head down, avoiding eye contact with the passers-by. He lived in a cramped, damp studio apartment in a neighborhood he used to make jokes about during cocktail hours. The wallpaper was peeling, the radiator hissed, but produced no heat, and the mailbox was full of final notices from creditors he could no longer afford to pay. The blacklisting had been absolute. The Kensington family didn't just fire him, they erased him. Every time Richard applied for a position, even junior analyst roles that were far beneath his previous station, the interview would go well until the background check. Then the silence would come. The phone would stop ringing. The emails would bounce. He was radioactive. The financial world was small, and no one wanted to offend the blue lion of the Kensington Empire by hiring the man who had abused its heiress. He had sold everything. The Rolex Submariner went first, paying for the divorce lawyer who eventually quit because Richard couldn't pay the retainer. The Italian suits were sold to consignment shops. The car was repossessed. Now Richard Sterling, the man who once critiqued the vintage of a Chateau Margaux, was walking toward the service entrance of the Royal Lancaster Hotel. He wasn't a guest. He was agency staff, a glorified temp waiter hired for the night because they were short-handed for the Global Philanthropy Gala. He pushed through the heavy metal doors of the kitchen, the smell of industrial dish soap and searing meat hitting him instantly. "Sterling, you're late," The shift manager, a red-faced man named O'Malley, barked. "Get your vest on. You're on table 4 through 8. And fix your hair. You look like you slept on a park bench." Richard gritted his teeth, the humiliation burning in his stomach like acid. "Yes, Mr. O'Malley. Sorry." He changed into the stiff, ill-fitting white jacket and black trousers provided by the agency. He looked in the cracked mirror of the locker room. The face staring back was gaunt. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow, haunted look. He looked 10 years older. "Table 1 is the VIPs," O'Malley shouted over the clatter of pots. "Do not, I repeat, do not mess up table 1. Stay away from it unless you're clearing. I've put Davis on wine service there. Sterling, you stick to the back tables. Keep your head down." Richard nodded, grabbing a tray of water glasses. He walked out into the ballroom. It was magnificent. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hung from the ceiling. The tables were draped in silk that shimmered under the golden light. The centerpieces were orchids and white roses costing more than Richard's rent for the year. The guests began to filter in. Men in tuxedos, women in couture gowns. Richard moved like a ghost, filling water glasses, offering bread rolls, trying to make himself invisible. He knew this world. He used to be this world. He saw men wearing the same cufflinks he used to own. He heard snippets of conversation about mergers, acquisitions, and summer homes in the Hamptons. It was physical torture to be so close to it, yet so far away. As the appetizers were served, Richard retreated to the shadows near the service station. He scanned the room, a habit he couldn't break. He saw faces he recognized. There was the CEO of Barclays. There was a tech mogul from Silicon Valley. And then he saw him. Sitting at table 3 was Arthur Halloway, his old boss. Richard froze. He ducked behind a pillar, his heart hammering against his ribs. Arthur looked older, more tired, but he was still there, still part of the club. Beside him was Evelyn wearing a new diamond necklace. "Sterling water on table 5. O'Malley hissed into his earpiece. Richard had to move. He took a pitcher of ice water and stepped out. He kept his head bowed, focusing entirely on the tablecloths. He moved efficiently, desperate to finish the round and get back to the kitchen. He was pouring water at table 5 when a voice carried over the din of the room, a voice that stopped his blood cold. "It really comes down to resilience, doesn't it?" Richard's hand trembled. A splash of water hit the tablecloth. "Watch it!" the guest at table 5 snapped. "Apologies, sir," Richard whispered, terrified. He slowly turned his head toward table 1. The VIP table at the center of the room raised slightly on a platform. She was there, Isabella. But it wasn't the Isabella he knew. The woman sitting at the head of the table was unrecognizable. The Isabella he remembered wore simple cotton dresses and apologized for taking up space. This woman was clad in a structured gown of deep midnight blue velvet that hugged her form and trailed elegantly onto the floor. Her hair, once kept in a messy bun to do housework, was cascading in polished waves over one shoulder. She wasn't just attending the gala. She was presiding over it. Around her neck sat the Kensington sapphires, a necklace Richard had only seen in history books. She was laughing softly at something the man next to her said. The man. Richard narrowed his eyes. He was striking dark hair, impeccable posture, wearing a sash that denoted some form of knighthood or royal order. He looked at Isabella not with possession, but with adoration. He listened to her as if her words were the only things that mattered in the room. Richard felt a wave of nausea. This was the woman he had called simple. The woman he had told was lucky to be with him. "Ladies and gentlemen," the master of ceremonies announced, the room quieting down. "Please welcome the recipient of this year's Humanitarian Excellence Award for her work with the Silent Voices Foundation, Her Grace Isabella Kensington, Duchess of Worcester." The room erupted. People didn't just clap, they stood. Arthur Halloway was on his feet, clapping enthusiastically. Richard stood frozen in the service aisle, clutching the water pitcher like a lifeline. Isabella walked to the podium. She moved with a fluidity and confidence that was breathtaking. She adjusted the microphone, looking out over the sea of faces. For a second her eyes seemed to sweep over the service area, and Richard ducked his head, terrified she would see him in his waiter's jacket. "Thank you," she said. Her voice, clear and melodious, projected through the high-quality speakers. 3 years ago I was living a very different life. I was living in a silence that I thought was my duty. I believed that making myself smaller would make the people around me feel bigger. Richard felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. She was talking about him. "I was told," Isabella continued, her voice gaining strength, "that I was uncomplicated, that my value lay in my domesticity and my ability to serve without complaint. I was told that I had no name without the one I was given by marriage." A few people in the audience murmured sympathetically. "But I learned that dignity is not something another person can give you, and it is certainly not something they can take away," she said, her eyes blazing. "I learned that the strongest steel is forged in the hottest fire. When I finally walked away from the darkness, I didn't just find my family again. I found my voice. And this foundation is for every woman and man who has been told they are nothing. You are everything." The applause was thunderous. Richard felt tears prickling his eyes, not of joy, but of a bitter, crushing realization. He had done this. He had forged this steel. He had created this queen by trying to treat her like a peasant. He watched as she returned to her seat. The man next to her stood up, took her hand, and kissed her knuckles before helping her sit. The intimacy of the gesture was so natural, so respectful, that it twisted a knife in Richard's gut. "Sterling Table 1 needs champagne," O'Malley whispered frantically in his ear. "Davis is stuck at the bar. Go now and don't screw it up." "No," Richard whispered. "I can't." "You go, or you're fired without pay," O'Malley threatened. "Move." Richard's legs felt like lead. He had no choice. He needed the 80 pounds this shift would pay him. He needed to eat. He walked over to the service station, grabbed a bottle of Dom Perignon, and wrapped it in a white linen napkin. He approached table 1. His heart was pounding so hard he thought it would crack a rib. He approached from the right side, moving toward the man first to avoid Isabella. "Champagne, sir." Richard's voice was a rasp. The man turned. Up close he was even more intimidating. "Please, thank you." Richard poured, his hand shaking slightly. He moved around the table. He filled the glass of the mayor of London. He filled the glass of a famous actress. And then he was standing beside her. The scent of her perfume hit him, jasmine and sandalwood. It was the same perfume she used to wear when they were dating, before he told her it was too strong and made her stop wearing it. He stared at the back of her neck, exposed by the elegant cut of her gown. "Madam," Richard croaked. Isabella turned. Time stopped. The clinking of silverware, the murmur of the crowd, the string quartet playing in the background, it all vanished. Isabella looked at the waiter. She looked at the cheap, ill-fitting white jacket. She looked at the thinning hair and the lines of exhaustion etched around the eyes. She looked at the trembling hand holding the champagne bottle. She looked into Richard's eyes. Richard waited for the anger. He waited for her to scream, to point him out, to have security drag him away, just to humiliate him as he had humiliated her. He braced himself for the sneer he deserved. But it never came. Isabella's expression didn't change. There was no anger. There was no triumph. There was no hate. There was nothing. It was a look of complete and utter indifference. It was the look one gives to a stranger on the subway or a piece of furniture in a hotel lobby. It was a look that said he was no longer a villain in her story. He was a footnote. He was irrelevant. "Thank you," she said politely, turning her glass slightly so he could pour. Richard stood there paralyzed. The indifference was worse than hatred. Hatred meant he still mattered. Hatred meant he still had power over her emotions. This polite dismissal was a death sentence to his ego. "Is everything all right?" the man beside her asked, looking at Richard with concern. "You look quite pale, man." Richard looked at the man. I... Isabella placed a hand on the man's arm. "He's fine, darling. Just pouring the wine." She didn't look back at Richard. She turned her attention entirely to her partner. "As you were saying, Alejandro, about the orphanage in Madrid." Richard finished pouring the wine. He felt invisible. He was the help. He was the background noise he had always demanded she be. He backed away, his face burning. As he retreated to the kitchen, he passed table 3. Arthur Halloway looked up. Their eyes locked. Arthur recognized him. His fork paused halfway to his mouth. He looked at Richard's uniform, then at the bottle in his hand. Arthur didn't say hello. He didn't sneer. He simply looked down at his plate, embarrassed for Richard, and continued eating. Richard burst through the kitchen doors, dumping the expensive champagne bottle into the ice bucket with a crash that made the dishwashers jump. "I'm done," Richard gasped, tearing off his bow tie. "I'm sick. I have to go." "You walk out now, you don't get paid," O'Malley shouted. "Keep it," Richard yelled, pushing past him. He ran out the service exit into the alleyway. The cold air hit him, but he was sweating profusely. He leaned against the brick wall, sliding down until he hit the wet pavement. He buried his face in his hands. He had wanted to be a king. He had wanted a wife who was a silent ornament. He had gotten exactly what he asked for. He was now the silent observer, watching the queen rule from a distance. The back door of the hotel opened nearby. Richard held his breath, hiding behind a dumpster. It was Isabella and Alejandro, flanked by her security team. They were leaving early, escaping the paparazzi out front. "Are you happy, Bella?" Alejandro asked softly, wrapping his coat around her shoulders to protect her from the wind. Isabella stopped just a few feet from where Richard was hiding in the dark. She looked up at the night sky, taking a deep breath of the London air. "I am," she said, her voice filled with a peace Richard had never heard before. "I finally feel like myself." "You were brilliant tonight," Alejandro said, kissing her forehead. "The car is this way." They walked toward a waiting limousine. Richard watched them go. He wanted to call out. He wanted to scream, "I'm sorry. Look at me, I exist." But he stayed silent. He remained in the shadows and the garbage of the alleyway, listening to the engine of the limousine purr as it carried his ex-wife back to a life of warmth, respect, and love. Richard Sterling sat alone in the cold. He realized then that the tragedy wasn't that he had lost her money. The tragedy was that he had held a woman capable of that much grace and strength in his arms every night for 3 years, and he had been too small, too petty, and too blind to see her. He pulled his thin coat tight, stood up on shaky legs, and began the long walk back to his empty apartment. The rain began to fall, washing away the traces of his tears, leaving him with nothing but the silence he had once forced upon her. Isabella's story is a powerful reminder that silence is not weakness, and humility is not stupidity. Richard made the fatal mistake of valuing his wife based on her utility to him rather than her inherent worth. He thought he was the main character of their life, failing to realize that by dimming her light, he was only ensuring he would eventually be left in the dark. In the end, karma didn't need to be aggressive. It simply removed the privilege of her presence from his life. Isabella didn't need to destroy him. She just needed to be herself. The moment she stopped hiding her power, his false reality crumbled. If you enjoyed this story of justice and hidden identity, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to share this video with a friend who needs a reminder of their own worth. And subscribe for more dramatic stories about karma, romance, and sweet revenge. See you in the next video.